So this video is how to replace the Driveshaft carrier bearings. I'm working on a 2012 Mercedes Sprinter V6 2500 3.0 liter. So this Sprinter, I'm getting some squeaking from the driveshaft, mostly when I have back torque. So when I let off the gas, it's squeaking from the driveshaft. I think it's probably the driveshaft carrier bearings. I didn't find a good video or write up online on how to do this, so I figured I'd do one. I've started the job. I've removed the driveshaft, so I'm gonna kind of skip ahead. Removing the driveshaft is not that bad. I'll get under the van here in a little bit and show how I did that or where I disconnected, but it's not too bad. Okay, so as you can see, I've already removed the driveshaft. There's 4 bolts at the rear differential. There's the 2 carrier bearings. I loosened everything first. You can go ahead and remove the safety bars. Those were probably the hardest to remove. I had to use some long extensions and a big impact, really long extensions to try to get past the gas tank. But with the big impact and those extensions, and then sometimes I had to resort to a ratchet, and it was just ratcheting a few degrees at a time. I was able to get it. Remove those safety bars first, then loosen everything up, the carrier bearings, the flange at the front, transmission, and then basically I just dropped everything. I used some jack stands to kind of help me hold the drive shaft because I was doing it by myself. Once everything was down, actually the drive shaft was kind of stuck to those flanges at the transmission and at the differential, so they just kind of stuck or stayed there. The drive shaft didn't drop or anything. I actually had to bang them with the rubber mallet to get that to fall. And then I had the jack stands already in place, so they kind of caught it, and then I just got the drive shaft off the jack stands and pulled it out from under the van and put it inside the garage. Okay, the most important thing when you're before you remove the drive shaft, obviously I've already removed it, but you want to do this before you remove the drive shaft. This is just easier for me to show it here. I use this little center punch to line up any flanges that are going to be separated. So the drive shaft to the transmission, you want to mark those. Any pieces that are going to come apart, you want to mark them. That way when you put it all back, you can line up the markings and make sure everything's lined up correctly, because it's all balanced together. Otherwise it'll be unbalanced. On this part, since it's kind of hard to get those markings lined up, they're already marked somewhere on here, but they already have markings, and it's good to make sure everything is nice and lined up and marked before you remove anything. So right there's a marking right there, and there's a marking right there. So everything should be lined up. Okay, so one thing that I was not aware of, I knew that rear drive shaft has the boot, and the whole drive shaft just slides on some splines. You can kind of see it shrinking and enlarging here. This thing just slides, so you just cut this and it slides. I wasn't sure how to remove this one. I hadn't removed these bolts. I removed the whole drive shaft as one. I was thinking that this piece just slid out like it does over there, but it doesn't. So I removed these bolts, and I realized that there's a little cert clip on here that you got to remove, and then this piece comes out, slides out. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove that and remove this flange so I can get to this center support bearing and start removing it. Okay, so sorry I didn't take as much video as I wanted to, but it's kind of turned into a bit of a nightmare, but I think I'm gonna be able to get it. So on the front carrier bearing, I was able to remove the flange from the drive shaft, but to my dismay, the whole bearing came out. I thought the bearing was going to stay on the drive shaft, and then I could use that drive shaft with the puller to take the bearing out. But no, so I'm gonna have to find a way to, maybe a socket or something to use with the puller to get the bearing off of this little flange. So when I got to that point, I moved on to the rear carrier bearing, and I encountered the same problem. When I separated the two pieces, I thought the bearing was gonna stay on this end, which I could use the puller on with that, but no, the bearing stayed on that end. So what I did is I took my puller and I used 30mm socket. I put that on the end of that hollow shaft, and then I needed something to rest this thing on, and so I had these little aluminum things. I think these are also for driving smaller bearings, and I put it on the end of this puller, the right one, I'm not sure where it went, and I was able to pull the bearing off. Well, here's the one. Here's what I used. However, before being able to pull the bearing off, I had to remove the outer sleeve, this thing. So I used a Sawzall to get that off, and at that point, there's no return. So it was a bit of a stressful moment, but I took a Sawzall to it, got it off. I used the puller and grabbed onto the back of that metal piece. That it was like this. Grabbed onto the back, and I used this 30mm socket, which fits right there without interfering. And then I used this on the end of this puller to not damage my socket. And it was a bit of a difficult to get everything lined up and start pulling. Could have used another set of hands, but once I got it going, it came off pretty easily. So now I'm gonna clean it up and I'm gonna put everything back, or put this bearing back, and then I'm gonna try the front one. We'll see how it goes. Okay, I'm waiting on my neighbor to help me. I need a 2-inch pipe for the drift on the rear bearing to install it. So while I'm waiting for him, I'm going to remove the front carrier bearing from that flange. As you can see, I already took a Sawzall and cut out the big frame. And this setup with my puller is much easier because I can just stand it up, whereas the other one I couldn't because it was on the drive shaft. So I'll stand it up. You can see I got the puller, a socket, and then that little thing to kind of hold the center all thread. I did put a little lubrication where that all thread is meeting that little aluminum piece to make sure there's not too much friction there. And now I'm gonna try to pull it off. Okay, it did come out. I did have to use my impact. It was just easier than trying to turn a ratchet. As you can see, the bearing came out, and then the little washer, or whatever this thing is, the end cap. And so now I can put a new bearing on that flange. As soon as I get that 2-inch pipe, which I'll use to help mount the new bearing. So you want to be pushing up against this piece, which is about 2 inches wide. So when the new bearing goes on, you'll use a drift for that. I was trying to use a socket to do that, but I don't have a socket big enough to be pressing on that bearing metal. You don't want to be pressing on any of the plastic. You want to be pressing on this inner metal rim. So about a 2-inch pipe will work just right. So I'm gonna mount that new one back on using a 2-inch pipe as soon as I give it my neighbor and get this 2-inch pipe. Okay, I'm getting ready to drive the new bearing on this flange. As you can see, I'm using a socket. I'm probably gonna go get a pipe here in a bit because the inner diameter is a bit smaller than the inner diameter of the bearing, and I don't want that. I want this thing to have a bigger inner diameter, but still be hitting on that metal. That way it doesn't interfere with the inside. It doesn't touch this when I'm driving it. This is the little protective cap that came on there. So I've already put that on, the bearing with the metal flange, the opening to the back. And now I'm gonna drive it in with this socket. I've already greased everything, so time to drive that in. So let's do that. Okay, I got the front bearing, carrier bearing mounted. I went to Ace and took my caliper to try to measure the right OD and ID to make sure it doesn't interfere with that inner part. So I knew that the inside of this could be no bigger than 45 millimeters, and then the outside part just needed to cover this inner race of the bearing, and so this fit perfectly. Spent more than I wanted to, but it does the job. So now I'm gonna mount this back onto the drive shaft. I'm gonna grease the splines, and then I'm gonna drive it back in using that thing again. Okay, I mounted the bearing back on this flange, and I mounted the flange back on the drive shaft using my little homemade drift. I was using that to drive this this flange onto the drive shaft. Once you do that, you replace that circlip. The new carrier bearing came with the new circlip. And then I only put this one protective cover. The backside has like a built-in protective cover. While I'm here, I double checked my U-joints, and these look okay. They flex in all directions. There's not a lot of play. All of them looked okay except for this last one. So it doesn't have any movement in one direction. I can't move it up and down, only side to side. So I think that U-joint is toast, which these are not replaceable. It means I have to replace my drive shaft. For now, I'm just gonna put it all back, and then I'll deal with that later. But now that I've got that bearing, I'm gonna mount this other bearing. So I'm gonna stand up this drive shaft to mount the new bearing. This carrier bearing does have the two protective covers plus the new boot. This comes with, it came with my my new bearing, and now I'll make sure I'll grease the splines on that, and let me reinstall this, and then we'll put this drive shaft back together. Okay, I got the rear bearing mounted. I had to flip this coupling around to get past that thicker part of the shaft, but everything's mounted up. Now I'm gonna put the boot on. So it's got a big end and a small end. I'll just put that on, and then just slide the spline onto the shaft. Make sure everything's lined up correctly. I'll check my marks here in a little bit. Make sure this is lined up correctly with that. Start putting everything back together. Oh, and of course grease the splines if I didn't already mention that. Okay, this is mounted back up. As you can see, I lined up that arrow with this arrow. It's kind of hard to see, but there's an arrow right there, and I marked it by dimpling it. Now I'm gonna put that flange back together. Again, make sure everything's lined up, and then I'm gonna torque that. Okay, so I've put the drive shaft back. I did have to get a new drive shaft because that U-joint right there was bad. It was only flexing in one direction and not the other. And for this 170-inch wheelbase van, it's got a 3-piece drive shaft, and the rear 2 pieces come as one from Mercedes. So I got a Mercedes remanufactured drive shaft. Torque values. So there's 3 of those flanges, one right here, one by the transmission, and then one in the middle. Those bolts are 11 foot-pounds plus 70 degrees. I just used my little DeWalt impact. I tested it, and it got it to about 50 degrees after the 11 foot-pounds. So I just took my impact, my little DeWalt impact, and snugged them all up, called it good, close enough. The carrier bearings and the safety bars, those are 74 foot-pounds. 74 foot-pounds on those. and then get everything back. Wasn't too tough. I installed the safety bars first, then the bearings. I was using the little jack stand to kind of hold the shaft in place, 2 jack stands, and then I did the ends. Obviously you want to put the transmission in neutral to be able to rotate the drive shaft. It was even necessary for me to take jack stands to lift the rear, and then I could turn the drive shaft. Once I had one flange in, I needed to turn the other in, and by lifting the rear axle, I was able to turn the drive shaft. So that's it. Oh, one thing I should have noted, if you're buying this drive shaft, this is a 3-piece, and I had to buy the rear 2 pieces. The part number for this 2012 Mercedes Sprinter 2500 is 906-410-7616. So my drive shaft did have that info on there, made it much easier and more secure to order the correct part. And these do have a core charge, so I had to return the old drive shaft. Okay, so that's it. I've replaced the drive shaft. I do want to apologize for the quality of this video. I didn't take as much video as I would have liked to be able to show you everything. Like I said, when I was pulling the drive shaft apart and trying to remove the bearings, I got a little stressed out because it's not what I thought it was going to be. I thought the bearings were going to be on the shaft end, but instead they were on the hollow end. So I was a little frustrated, was trying to figure it out more than trying to capture video, so I apologize for that. And then once I had the 2 bearings on, the new bearings mounted, I went to check all my U-joints, which you should do if you have the drive shaft off, check all your U-joints. Got down to the last U-joint, they were all flexing in 2 directions like they should. That's what a U-joint does. Got down to the last one and it was only flexing, articulating in one direction, and it was seized up in the other direction. I saw a lot of red, rust-colored staining, so I knew that U-joint was bad. I was also noticing right around the same time I heard noise from my drive shaft, my rear differential input shaft started leaking, just wet, not really dripping. And I think it was because that U-joint that was bad was close to the drive shaft. And I think when it was getting to a position where the drive shaft needed to flex and it hit that U-joint that was seized, it was putting the stress on that seal on the input of my differential, which was causing it to leak. So anyways, my drive shaft is a 3-piece drive shaft. It had the part numbers. You can buy them in 2 separate pieces from Mercedes Benz. The front piece by itself, and then the rear piece, the rear 2 pieces come as one. That's the part I needed to order from Mercedes Benz. It was $800 after the core charge. So $890 minus $90 for the core charge. And then once I received it, I just put everything back. Again, I apologize for the quality of the video. Yeah, so it wasn't too bad of a job doing the carrier bearings, but it ended up being more than that for me. But hopefully, now that I've done this, hopefully I should have many miles without needing to mess with the drivetrain or the carrier bearings or the drive shaft. So thanks.